Yes, now the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, will tell police this week that tackling violence against women and girls should be as much a priority as fighting terrorism. A police watchdog previously found, quote, problems, unevenness and inconsistencies in the way what they call the epidemic of violence against female victims was dealt with in the UK.
In fact, the Inspector of the Constabulary, Zoe Billingham, said it was vital the violence against women and girls should be within the top 3 priorities of the police force. And we're joined now by Suzanne Jacob, CEO of SafeLives, a UK-based charity working in the area of domestic violence. Thank you very much for joining us. So just paint the picture for us of what the reality is, really, why it needs to be taken more seriously.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the programme this morning. And I guess the critical thing is thinking of this as a security threat. And this is a security threat that people are living with in their own homes. So in terms of domestic abuse, we know that there were 100 bereaved families last year, at least, because somebody was murdered as a result of domestic abuse. We know that 100,000 cases of really high-risk domestic abuse, that's where there's an imminent risk of serious harm or murder, were seen through multi-agency risk assessment processes. So this is a really, really serious problem. And yes, we believe it should be on the same footing as terrorism. Not to take anything away from terrorism, it's an incredibly important security risk, but this is as well. And we think that there is more that can be done to tackle this problem, to take it seriously, and to bring an end to domestic abuse for everyone and for good.
And what does this mean in practice? What changes would this bring about, this making this a policing priority?
Well, mostly this is about making sure that every time the most senior police officers in this country around the table, that they're talking about violence against women and girls in the same way that they're talking about counter-terrorism and they're talking about serious and organised crime. It also means giving status to the brilliant police officers who tackle this kind of crime and giving them credit for doing that work. So at the moment, it can be seen as quite low status work to be tackling domestic abuse and other types of violence against women and girls. We need it to have the same status as if you're on the front line of counter-terrorism, if you're on the front line of public order problems, making sure it's got that status, making sure it's joined up with other crime types. So making sure we're not thinking of people who use abusive behaviour just on that basis, but also looking into the other types of criminal offending they might be involved with and join up that picture, which is so often not the case, and just giving urgency and priority to this work so that we stop those domestic homicides and we stop the really serious violence and control that's going on in many households around the country.
And more broadly, do you think the government is doing enough or has a plan, really, to tackle domestic violence more broadly? Because I suppose the policing aspect is only just one aspect to tackling the issue.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And at SafeLives, we've been working for a very long time as an organisation to try and get those other big agencies more involved in bringing an end to domestic abuse. So if you think in particular that all of us, whoever we are, wherever we are in the country, will use health services, and it can be evident in those health services that there's something wrong for us at home, something really wrong, which is impacting on our physical and mental health. But at the moment, we don't see anywhere near enough priority given to these issues inside the health service, even though because they don't tackle it at an early stage, they as the health service are then kind of paying the cost later on and the types of injuries and harm that's happening for people. So we'd really love to see this extended out into other parts of government in a very serious way and given the same priority in the Department of Health, the Department of Education, as it is being given in the Home Office and Ministry of Justice.
Yes, indeed. Well, look, obviously, we wish you very, very well with everything that you're trying to achieve, and it's a massive issue, clearly. It needs tackling head on. Thank you very, very much for your time. Suzanne Jacob, their CEO of SafeLives, a UK-based charity, which, of course, is working in that area of domestic violence. Now, Nicola Graham-Kevan, a Professor of Criminal Justice Psychology at the University of Central Lancashire, now joins us to discuss this further as well, I believe. Yeah, so yeah. Well, look, can this be tackled without considering any kind of psychological perspective? How important is the psychology behind all of this?
The psychology behind domestic abuse is really important. What we know is many victims actually don't necessarily want a criminal justice response. or at least not exclusively a criminal justice response. And obviously moving it into the realms of terrorism must cause some alarm bells there. I mean, domestic abuse is a lot broader than women and girls. It's also men and boys. The empirical literature tells us that men and boys are equally likely to be subject to domestic abuse, including partner violence, which may be a bit of a surprise to many people. The research has been consistent since the 1970s on that. And so we need to be looking at the psychology behind it. We've recently been doing a project with the Home Office and Lancashire Constabulary on child-to-parent abuse. And there we find that many of the victims do not want a criminal justice response. They would like support for the young person. I mean, in these cases, they're actually adults of 18 and over, 16 and over, but they don't want a criminal justice response. And we find the same in partner violence. You know, many couples who separate potentially through child protection issues will actually get back together again, you know, without people knowing. So there needs to be criminal justice response, certainly, but there also needs to be, as Nicole said, a wider response. And that response needs to recognise men and boys as well as girls and women.
Yeah, there's a really kind of, completely unfair comment that is made all too often, unfortunately, when, the times I've heard it anyway, is it's always been a woman has been the victim anyway, and she's gone back to him again. She's gone back to him again. She's gone back to him again. And, there's a psychology behind that, isn't there? Can you explain that?
There's many reasons that men or women who are victims of partner violence will return to the person who abused them. And that includes traumatic bonding. So people who've had very difficult early childhoods themselves often have a need to have a family and attachment figure, and that can override safety concerns. There's also concerns around marriage being, and relationships being important. There's concerns around feeling sorry for your partner, understanding, that, or believing that the abuse comes from, mental health problems or prior adversity and stresses in their lives. So there's many reasons why a partner may choose to not leave or may choose to return to somebody who's been identified as being abusive.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that to us. Really useful there. Nicola Graham-Kevan, a Professor of Criminal Justice Psychology at the University of Central Lancashire.
It is absolutely fascinating, again, obviously in a very tragic sense, but, to think of the psychology elements of it as well, both of those people who do the abusing and those people who sadly are abused. And, there is that, like the traumatic bonding, for example. And it's strange because it almost defies all logic, doesn't it? You think, I would never let that happen to me.
Yeah.
Or I would never, if that happened to me, I'd be straight off. Yeah. But actually, all too often, it doesn't happen.
And often because there's so much manipulation involved and sort of psychological abuse, it's so easy to fall into that kind of relationship because it's not often just somebody doesn't just become suddenly violent. It builds up over years in many cases, and lots of psychological abuse does take place.